I'm going to reveal the true reason why millions of black people now think in ways that are beneficial to the white society. More specifically, I will demonstrate why millions of black people now constantly seeks white approval, perceives it that slavery benefited us, and perceives ourselves as being our own worst enemies, and reveres Caucasians in spite of such a brutally horrific history of the contrary. I will do so while simultaneously demonstrating that it has nothing to do with the Willie Lynch myth nor the Stockholm Syndrome. It will be the truth of our plight and condition. Those who know must teach, African proverb. First, here's the true reason why millions of black people now constantly seeks white approval. Black people have been trauma bonded by the white society. Black people are within a trauma bonded abusive relationship with a narcissistic white society. And just like within most trauma bonded abusive relationship, they've manipulated many black people to believe that their mistreatments of us is our own fault. It's a psychological mind hack. Usually the term trauma bonded refers to a gaslighting mental abuse that occurs within an abusive relationship wherein which one partner is manipulated and mentally abused by a narcissistic partner. Within that scenario, after repeatedly brutalizing the victim, the narcissistic abusive partner never acknowledges any of his wrongdoing. He instead minimizes the abuse and tells his victim that the abuse wasn't that bad and to just shut up and get over it. He then constantly inundates the victim with demoralizing, disapproving narratives about the victim. This is continued until the victim stops focusing on the abuse and instead focuses only on the demoralizing, disapproving narratives. This shifting of focus causes the abused victim to, rather than resenting the abuser, they instead seeks the approval of the abuser. This trauma bonding effect provides the abuser with a more favorable outcome from the victim rather than having the victim hating and resenting the abuser. The human mind is easily manipulated when the victim is unaware of what's being done to their mind. It's a well-proven gaslighting tactic. Likewise, that same trauma bonding, abusive, manipulating tactic is what white social engineering scientists and white propagandists have done to the black population. After brutalizing black people for many centuries, the white society never acknowledged any of their horrible deeds and wrongdoings. They instead insist that the abuse of black people wasn't that bad and to tell black people to just shut up and get over it. They then constantly inundate the black population with black racially demoralizing, disapproving narratives about ourselves. Therefore, rather than resenting the white society for their brutal mistreatment of us, many of us instead focuses on the narratives, the disapproving narratives, and we therefore tries to win their approval. Many black people will go out of their way to try to show white people that we're not all bad. Black people are within an abusive relationship with a narcissistic white society. And just like within most abusive relationships, they've manipulated many black people to, instead of focusing on the abuse that they've done to us, to instead seek their approval. It's a gaslighting psychological warfare mind hack. The minds of targeted populations are quite easy to manipulate if they're unaware of what's being done to them. Once minds have been confused, manipulation becomes simple. The mind will even ignore common sense and rationality falls away, even overlooking hypocrisy and deception. Now, here's the true reason why millions of African Americans now feel grateful to the white society for having enslaved our ancestors. During the 1960s, white social scientists were hired by the Kerner Commission to study the African American population to understand the reason for that decade's unprecedented unified black protests. They determined that one aggravating factor was that millions of African Americans had developed an allegiance towards Africa that hindered the growth of black patriotism towards the U.S. African Americans' strong allegiance towards Africa was made evident during the 1960s by the fact that many African Americans had started wearing afros, cornrows, dashikis, and many had given themselves African names. White social scientists determined that this allegiance toward Africa also fueled the Black Pride and Black Power movements, which were also identified as aggravating factors for that decade's unprecedented black protests. They therefore decided that African Americans' allegiance towards Africa had to be eroded. To meet that objective, white propaganda designers were hired their job was to begin negatively distorting the image of Africa within the collective minds of African Americans. They therefore started subjecting African Americans to seeing only the poorest parts of Africa, those images of war-torn, famine-ridden, and disease-stricken Africa. By only showing the poorest parts of Africa, this turned Africa into a source of shame and humiliation for millions of African Americans. Because they did this because it's easier to separate a people from something they've been made to feel ashamed of. Those negatively distorted depictions of Africa conveys a subliminal message that African Americans actually benefited from slavery. It makes many perceive the enslavement of our ancestors as having been more of a rescue mission that ultimately took us away from the terrible, scary, and backwards place of Africa. This propaganda campaign literally causes millions of African Americans to feel grateful that slavery happened. This propaganda campaign significantly reduced African Americans' allegiance towards Africa. It in fact works so effectively that nowadays millions of African Americans are so embarrassed by their African heritage that many will now accept any frivolous claim that allows them to claim themselves as being anything other than an African. It's always by deliberate design whenever the oppressed population starts thinking exactly as their oppressors wants them to think. Through the white society's monopoly over the media images and the narratives that are fed into the collective minds of the black population, they've manipulated millions of us to think in ways that serves and protects the interests of the white society. Now, here's the true reason why millions of African Americans now perceives ourselves as being our own worst enemies and reveres Caucasians in spite of a brutally horrific history to the contrary. Those same white social scientists hired by the Kerner Commission determined that another aggravating factor for 1960s unprecedented unified black protests was caused by an elevated and unifying black collective self-esteem brought on by the emergence of that decade's Black Pride movement. They also learned then, by studying the African American population, that while oppressors, through their weaponry advantages of guns, cannons, and rifles, were able to brutally invade and enslave we Africans, they, however, cannot win our loyalty or sustain peace with us indefinitely unless our collective minds have been manipulated to think in ways that prevents us from unifying and seeking retribution against our oppressors. Because they learn that whenever people are oppressed for long durations, their collective aggressions against their oppressors will continue to grow until it reaches a boiling point, resulting in acts of massive rebellion against their oppressors. The oppressed always eventually rebels against their oppressors. This is an inherent response within the collective human psyche whenever people are being oppressed for long periods. This is what was actually happening amongst the African American population during the 1960s. White racism had reached a boiling point within the collective psyches of the African American population, which resulted in that decade's unprecedented unified Black protest. Those white social scientists logically determined that they could subdue unified Black protest by deploying a psychological warfare propaganda campaign that keeps the collective self-esteem of the Black masses very low and that shifts Black collective aggressions away from the white society and redirects it towards and against ourselves. This is the true reason why all of our narratives today that we receive from white sources are consistently negative and Black racially demoralizing. When you critically think, can you not see just how cartoonishly unrealistic this scenario actually is? The white media's unrelenting negative depiction of the Black population that amplifies the negative to the point that it distorts our reality. It's much more than just biased media reporting. It is actually an insidious Black racially demoralizing divide and rule psychological warfare propaganda campaign. Demoralized divide and rule is a method of maintaining control over a targeted population through constant and unrelenting demoralization in order to produce self-hatred and division between them. This is possible because people are like computers. All you have to do is keep giving people certain information every so often, and you can persuade an entire generation towards an applied objective. This propaganda campaign is deployed like a massive media marketing campaign that constantly subjects the Black population to receiving only the fraudulent worst narratives about ourselves. Within this system, fraudulent Black racially demoralizing propaganda is being pumped unrelentingly into the unsuspecting minds of the Black population, without being challenged nor counterbalanced by an equal amount of Black positive racially affirming information. It conveys the subliminal message that Black people are now our own worst enemies and that we therefore need whites to govern over our lives. Moreover, that Black people should admire, respect, and trust only whites. This system is extremely effective because when Black people are repetitively presented these noted narratives from trusted white media sources, it can be very difficult to resist its implied propaganda programming, especially when the propaganda is being told daily and so unrelentingly. Keeping us believing the fraudulent worst about ourselves is how white oppressive forces now prevents us from unifying ourselves against them. Its weapon is the demoralizing message that it carries and the way that it negatively impacts the Black population in terms of our behavior and our unity. People are easily controlled by the information that they receive about themselves, especially when they're unaware that the information has been distorted to invoke specific responses from them. When people are constantly fed negative information about themselves, they become demoralized, divided, self-loathing, and they become more compliant with their oppressor's dominance over their lives. In fact, many will even prefer it. It also creates Black self-hatred and disunity, which attacks the core foundation of what bonds us as a people. And as long as we're kept within this condition, we can then be ruled over forever. This nefarious psychological warfare tactic works by tapping into the immense power that shame has upon the human mind to mentally enslave millions of Black people. And it doesn't matter that the information being presented to us is untrue. Most Black people will respond accordingly because they've all received the same false information. This is all possible because the human mind is like a computer. No matter how efficient it may be, its reliability is only as great as the information fed into it. If it's possible to control the input of information that a population received, then no matter how intelligent they may be, it's entirely possible to control what they'll believe. Because the white society writes all of our narratives and controls all of our mainstream media images, they literally own our interpretation of ourselves. This allows them to easily negatively distort what we believe about ourselves. Some Black people have been so heavily demoralized by the white society's fraudulent negative depictions of our racial group that many literally find it easier to continue believing the fraudulent worst about ourselves than to accept the truth that we're being lied to, because it makes us easier to be controlled. Those Black people that insist that they've confirmed their negative assessments about our racial group based upon their own experiences are in fact delusional, because it's not humanly possible to accurately assess the collective state of millions of people based upon anyone's individual experiences. It's not humanly possible. Those false negative perceptions about our racial group were in fact actually deliberately embedded into our minds by white oppressive forces that exclusively writes all of our narratives and that controls all of our mainstream media images. The reason why many Black people insist that they confirm their negative assessments about our racial group based upon their own experience, although they've in fact not, is because once a false belief has been successfully embedded into the human mind, a person will then only notice those incidents that appears to confirm the embedded belief and will become psychologically blinded from noticing the greater amount of evidence refuting the embedded belief. And then based upon this psychological blindness, they will insist that they've confirmed it, although they've not. Case, point, and proof. Those Black people that had been manipulated by white media propagandists to believe that our racial group never supports each other ignored the fact that during the 2008 election of President Obama, he received more Black votes than any other previous president in U.S. history. Millions of Black people that had never before voted in any previous election registered and voted for Obama in 2008. In some states, Black people stood in voting lines from up to 4 hours. During Obama's inauguration, millions of Black people showed up in Washington, D.C. in record-breaking numbers at their own expenses, staying in those very expensive hotels. They did it to see the first African-American president being sworn in, and they stood in cold temperatures, totally disputing the fact that Black people never support each other. And Obama received more than 95% of the Black votes. These facts totally shows that it's untrue that Black people never support each other. But those people who believe it have been brainwashed, so therefore they don't see it. They're psychologically blinded from seeing what goes against their embedded belief. White oppressive forces have created an elaborate prison for our minds. And those of us who tell you the truth are trying to free you from a mental prison and you don't even know you're trapped within. It's time to wake up to our reality. One love and peace.